Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here. This is my, I have to say, this is my first time at the Baltic Forum. So I shall not talk about how bad the relations are. I think that is obvious. I set out a rather ambitious goal of trying to present my view as to how did we get here, and what will probably happen next, and what we should do about it. How did we get here? I'll try to maybe describe how it looks from my side, what these dueling perspectives are from the United States and from the Russian side. So let's start with the United States. Well, the United States is quite clearly driven by what I would describe as a value-based moral imperative. Right? Political freedoms, human rights, individual liberties, democracies, so these are not just empty words, they are at the very fabric of the American model. So the United States, whether the others like it or not, but feels impelled to help other people who want to share some of these freedoms to help achieve it. Right? So some may call it, as the US is in different times of its history, is on a sort of a moral crusade. Again, like it or not, but this is what the United States is. We get to Russia, I think the key, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, to understanding the Russian perspective actually lies in the 1990s and not that much in the recent years. In the 1990s, I think there is no doubt that there's been a very sincere and wholehearted attempt in Russia to embrace the Western political and economic model. Right? So, full way forward, so to speak. So there's different opinions as to why it ended, how it ended, and whose fault it is, and so on. But I think there is little doubt that the majority of the Russian people saw the result of this is that the country came very close to the brink of, well, possibly its destruction. Separation of the regions, economic breakdown, many, many other things. So I think this has traumatized the consciousness of the policymakers in Russia. Since then, we have seen the rolling back, sort of the taking back control, which, of course, the US has seen rightly as moving to the more authoritarian direction. It did not help then that when the events happened in Iraq somewhat later, then this has only reinforced the suspicions in Russia that at its best, America is too optimistic about whether it really knows of how to transition to a working democracy. Iraq has demonstrated what I would say as the great superiority of the military technology over the, let's call it the social sciences technology. Where the military victory was fast, it turned out that removing a dictator and saying that, well, now once every 4 years you can vote for a new leader does not get you very far to a stable and a well-functioning democracy. So this was also an important lesson to learn. So the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is that we have these two irreconcilable narratives on the two sides. What the United States sees as its moral end, that is achieving a liberal democratic order in many countries, my interpretation is that in Russia it is more seen as a means to its, well, possibly quite literal end, right? A disintegration of the country, disintegration of public order. So at the moment, as I see it, these two narratives cannot be reconciled, so that's why we hear so much and so often hear about this, well, different understandings of what is driving the events and why what is happening is happening. It's another important development that has happened that I would like to raise is the rise of China. In what sense? In the 1990s, when I was a young economist, well, he's another colleague present here at that time, everything seemed clear. Right? There was one economic model, the Soviet Union, central planning, that failed. There is a successful economic model that is associated with democracy and free market economy, a general equation of political and economic freedoms, and that is the way forward. As we all know, over the last 25 years, the rise of China transformed what was earlier seen as an intellectual curiosity, that is, a bunch of states in the East Asia that achieved economic miracles without committing to what we could understand as a full-fledged democracies. But China has achieved spectacular economic growth without having a democracy at the same time. And that, of course, has changed, I would say, dramatically the views on what's possible the way forward is. What next? Let me make some predictions. I think the Russian side understands the lesson of the Soviet Union very well. And that is that the isolation has, and by isolation I mean isolation in its broadest sense, isolation from what I would call the circulation of ideas, investment, and competition. That the isolation has a very heavy economic price. This is not just a lesson of the Soviet Union. The other countries that we know historically were in isolation, Japan, is a very spectacular example, paid a very heavy price for this. So I saw clearly, and now I'm not talking about the sanctions in the narrow sense, because now it is not just sanctions. We see a general reluctance of the Western businesses and investors to go to Russia. Russia faces the risk of this isolation in its very broadest sense. In the non-paper of Mr. Jurgens, I saw that there is a base scenario in Russia of GDP growth of 2% into 2035. If that would really be the case, then Russia would drive itself into substantial relative backwardness as compared to the leading countries by that time. So this, on the one hand, may seem that, as Mr. Pildegovich in his talk mentioned, what was this, the first school of thought? Let's just sit back and wait what happens. The time is probably not on the Russian side. However, I would argue strongly against it, as I think we can be quite sure that, to borrow from the line from one American blockbuster, that Russia will not go silently into the night while these economic tendencies take hold. And I think over the last years we have seen evidence that this is indeed the case. So what should be done, or what is the way forward? As an economist by training, I see the way forward is clearly economic. How can the problem of isolation be solved? It may be probably naive to think that in the present atmosphere the foreign investors would readily flock to Moscow or to St. Petersburg or to other Russian cities. However, let me go back in history in the beginning of the 20th century and see what was the role of Riga back then. Riga was then, in terms of trade, third or fourth largest, most important city in what was then the Russian Empire. Why? Substantial tariffs in Russia made it hard for the Western-produced goods to be sold to Russia, so the investment went to the territory where the Western investors knew best, because of the German population. That was in Latvia. Right? So I believe that Riga holds the key, actually, to solving the problem of potential isolation and to bringing mutual economic benefits to Russia, to the West, and of course for Riga to returning to its Hanseatic destiny. As concerns, so of course the dialogue on the working relationship is needed. We see that lately in too many places the genie has been let out of the bottle. Right? So the relations between the US and Russia, and also Europe and Russia, has become so toxic that to mind comes a memory of a picture of one gathering in Washington with many people talking to each other, and in the middle of it is the Russian ambassador, Mr. Kislyak, who seems to be standing there all by alone, right? So in these circumstances, I think the dialogue in the format of the think tanks, this, what I understand the diplomatic corps call the track 2 dialogue, is the only viable option today and perhaps in the years to come. So we are talking not just about the opportunity, given that we are talking actually about a heavy burden of responsibility for this dialogue. And that is in our hands. Thank you.